what color skin they have or what they're wearing, and then you kind of put them in a box and you think that you know much about them and what their dinner table looks like and who they vote for, and what I've discovered working on the show is how rarely that's true. And what we tried to do with the show was to play this little trick, which I guess you do when creating a podcast, which was that by eliminating the visual element, we would enable our audience a little bit more time in which they can suspend their judgment and not put someone in a box.
I am Royfield Brown, and our session is called How We Tell History, Perspectives and Point of View in History Podcasting. I do too many podcasts that I care to mention, but I'm going to mention them. So I do 10 American Presidents, How Jamaica Conquered the World, and I have to read them out if I do that many. Dumpty Dum, The Things That Made England, Mid-Atlantic, Map Porn, and Intelligent Speech. I'm joined on this panel by, let's start at the far end.
Robin Pearson, The History of Byzantium.
My name is Mishi Harman, and I am the host of a podcast called Israel Story.
I'm Sarah Handley-Cousins, and I'm one of the 4 producers of Dig, a history podcast.
I'm Matt Breen, and I do the Explorers podcast.
Now, I've been on a few panels before, specifically kind of podcasting panels. It's always weird to me that we talk and interrogate people without at least listening to a bit of their work. So what I did was to ask our esteemed panel to basically give me little clips of their audio. So we've got an hour today, so I thought let's have 10 minutes and let's listen to their work.
Mr. Pop. That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
77 years ago,
When in the course of human events,
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America.
Lincoln had a sort of complicated relationship with the Native Americans, or the Indian tribes as he would have thought of them. And it started with some history that he learned when he was a very young boy. His grandfather, that is Thomas's father, who was also named Abraham Lincoln, was killed by an Indian in the late 18th century. The Indian who went ahead and was about to snatch Thomas away before one of their other relatives retaliated and killed the Indian. So Abraham grew up hearing this story from his father Thomas and being very aware of Indian attacks. And there were a number of examples of Indian attacks on the white settlers on the frontier where Lincoln was living with his family. Of course, in the bigger picture, those attacks were dwarfed by the policy of the United States government in pushing the Indians further and further west by force if necessary, killing lots of Indians and dispossessing them of their tribal heritage lands. But it was definitely an issue that Lincoln was aware of. I think there's good evidence that Lincoln saw the humanity in the Native Americans. Much later, during the Civil War, he commuted the death sentences of a very large number of Indians who had been sentenced to death for murders that were committed during the Civil War. But at the same time, during his own service in the Black Hawk War, he came across the scene of several notable Indian atrocities, places where Indians had killed and scalped a number of Lincoln's fellow white soldiers, and it's hard to imagine that that didn't have a big impact on Lincoln's psyche. More generally, the white settlers in the region, that is the western areas where Lincoln and his family were, Illinois and Indiana and Kentucky, had a little bit of a mixed relationship with the Indians. It was certainly at times transactional, that is, especially the first white settlers in areas. Oftentimes the Indians in an area would outnumber the whites, and there would be active back and forth between the two groups of people. What tended to happen, though, is as more and more white settlers poured into an area, they came into conflict with the Indians, and the result was consistently over time the Indians being cleared out forcibly and pushed further and further west.
Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
Today we're talking about sex and the Puritans. Even before English people had arrived in the New World, they were envisioning the very land in a sexual way, describing it as a, quote, fair virgin longing to be sped and meet her lover in a nuptial bed. In a way, they thought of it as a kind of Garden of Eden, an unpopulated wilderness that needed people to procreate. For example, a book written in the 1600s called The Isle of Pines described a young man named George Pine who was shipwrecked with several women. Convenient, right? A teenage girl, 2 maidservants, and an enslaved woman. After a little while, George and the maidservants started having sex. Quote, at first in private. Sorry, this is so funny. Stop looking at me, it's make me laugh more. After a while, George and the maidservants started having sex. Quote, at first in private, but after, custom taking away our shame, there being none but us, we did it more openly as our lust gave us liberty. Soon, George was also having sex with the teenage girl and the enslaved woman. Before long, he and his nearly 2,000 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have populated this island. Get it? Why it was called the Isle of Pines?
Because they're a bunch of George Pine's descendants.
Yeah, because he populated the whole island with his own children.
Which is with his own little pines.
His own
Not
little
like
pines.
actual pines.
Correct.
Right, okay. Hilarious.
Hilarious.
When I got it, I was like, oh!
Now, when a king wants to become your tenant, I guess you can't really say.
I mean, it's an honor to have this relationship with King Hussein.
So without too much hesitation, Abdelmoti Qutb
Offered it to him with pleasure.
They soon signed a lease. The Qutbs, who had basically just moved in, repacked their bags and moved out. In their lavish new villa, it was now a palace, an actual palace.
Yes, it was called King Hussein's Royal Palace. And there was a crown and a sign here on the street saying, don't blow your horn, because this is a royal palace. And these are things from the past, good memories.
Were people killed on Tel El-Ful?
I think that 3 or 4 soldiers were killed on Tel El-Ful itself.
Israeli soldiers.
Israeli soldiers, of course. But
and
the Jordanian were, I don't remember exactly, but about 10-15 soldiers, Jordanian or more, were killed on this hill.
Was there also any resistance by the local population?
There was no population, no civilians were there. Nothing was populated on Tel El-Ful. It was empty. Bet Hanina was populated with people, but they were all in their villas or the buildings, and no one was on the street. They were very frightened, I believe.
So you didn't even see them?
No, we didn't see them. Nobody was on the street, nobody. We didn't see any Arab people there.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of Byzantium. You are standing on top of a wall, staring into the distance. You're sure you can see something. The morning light is only a few minutes old, so you're squinting hard. It could just be birds, No. You're increasingly sure that the movement you see is the enemy on the move. Dust is rising on the horizon, and the number of small black dots you can make out must be an army. You call for your commander to be woken. Your paranoia over disturbing him needlessly now overtaken by the fear gripping your whole body. He climbs the ladder to the top of the fort. You point. He looks. He turns to you. Go now, on the road to Lulon, as fast as you can. Head straight for the fort by the ridge and tell the Decarch there to send out riders immediately. What are you waiting for? Go! Now!
Hello, and welcome to the Explorers Podcast. Today is part 4 in our series on Francis Drake. Last time, we left Drake poised to enter the Strait of Magellan and go about harassing Spanish shipping on the western coast of the Americas. However, the voyage to this point had been heavy with controversy. Drake had suspected that one of the noblemen in the fleet, Thomas Doughty, had been plotting mutiny against him. The two strong-willed men had clashed repeatedly, leading Drake to arrest Doughty. Doughty would be put on trial for mutiny and treason. He would be convicted and sentenced to death. The trial and execution are mired in controversy, as many feel that Drake didn't have the power to condemn a man like Doughty, or even if Doughty had been plotting mutiny. It was not Drake's finest hour. In the end, Doughty was executed, and with that, Drake was putting a target on his back, since once he returned to England, he would need to justify his actions to the Crown, who did not take kindly to such behavior.
So this session is about history and our perspectives, and specifically how we go about creating our shows. I've been listening to one of the podcasts. One of the podcasters on this panel for years, and he has a very interesting and unique origin story. So what I'm going to do is ask everybody what their origin story is. You've got 2 minutes. Mr. Robin, over to you, sir. So tell us how you came up with your podcast.
I was always interested in Roman history throughout my life, and when I was at university, I found a book, The Penguin Medieval Atlas, which is much more interesting than it sounds. It showed a map of Europe. The map doesn't change, but the political states on it change every time you turn. It's moving forward 50, 100 years. And I was fascinated to see that the Roman Empire was still there when the Kingdom of England and France and Germany and places are developing. And hey, why is the Roman Empire still there in what's now Greece and Turkey? And I thought, this is an amazing story. So I read a little more about Byzantium, but I didn't think anything more of it until the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan came out. Now, I'd read a few Roman history books that covered the whole of the history of Rome, but by the end of the book I'd forgotten what the beginning was. There's just too much to take in. And I often found that with books. And I found with the podcast, here was someone holding your hand saying, well, last time we talked about this, and now we're going to talk about this. And I thought, it's all coming together. I knew all these famous stories, but to have them all connected, I thought, this is fantastic. So when Mike said, oh, I'm going to stop now in 476, I went to my email and I said, dear Mike, this is a bad idea. You need to carry on. I really think people would pay you to carry on. And he was happy ending where it was. So I myself had been podcasting for fun, and I thought, now that he's finished, is that something I could possibly do? And I decided to go for it.
Mishi, your podcast story, I think, is going to be atypical in terms of it doesn't appear to be that you are a solo podcast. You have a team. So tell us about Israel's story, how you came up with that idea, and tell us the team behind the initial production.
Sure. So the very short answer of how I became a podcaster is completely by chance. And the slightly longer answer is that I'm from Jerusalem. After my army service, I came to the States for college, and I didn't really know what I wanted to study, but my father told me that when in doubt, always study history, because you can make the argument that history is everything that happened till right now, which is basically everything. And I would constantly go into the history department office and say, that course that I took about astronomy, that happened in the past, and the course that I took about Beethoven, that also happened in the past. So all of this is really history. And I did my undergrad and did a graduate degree in archaeology, and then didn't really know what to do in life, and I decided to go back home to Israel and write a PhD in history, which I did. But right beforehand, I decided to mark the end of this period that I had spent in the States by buying a 2000 Ford Focus station wagon and putting my dog Nomi in the back and going to search for America. And we went on this massive 20,000 kilometer road trip across all of America, which if I can impart one piece of wisdom this morning, it is if you go on a massive road trip across America, take a dog, because it's a breaker of all social barriers, and people come up to you and it's completely socially acceptable to come up to a stranger and pet their dog and start talking to them, but not acceptable to come up to a stranger and start petting them and start talking to them. And on that trip, I started listening. This was in 2010. I started listening to This American Life, and I said to myself, you know what? We should do this in Israel. There was nothing at all similar to it. And I got 3 of my closest childhood friends together, and we sat in my living room, and I played them an episode of This American Life, and we said, we don't know anything about radio, we don't know anything about journalism, about media, but we've been on many dates, and we've told stories on those dates, so we can probably tell a story, and that is how we began. And our show is not actually a history podcast per se, but
Be gone from this panel then, sir.
But of course, as my father told me, history is everything that happened till right now, and almost everything on the podcast happened before this second. So,
and Sarah, your show is one of these kind of podcasting conventions where you have one person speaking into a microphone, or you have 2. So tell us how you met your partner, and tell us about your origin story.
So we initially launched in 2015 as a different podcast, as the History Buffs podcast, and we had no plan. We didn't think about it really at all, and so we just kind of didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have a clear vision, and in the process of sort of realizing that we had no idea what we were doing.
So as a professor, you came to the project unprepared.
Yes. Well, I should say we were grad students at the time, so that might explain it. But we, during that project, kind of brought us into the world of history podcasting. We were sort of, as you say, like I was also listening to This American Life and found that very inspirational, but didn't know a lot about history podcasts as a genre. And so as we were thinking about killing our old project and relaunching as what is now Dig, we spent a lot of time listening to other history podcasts and looking at what existed, and realizing that there was really not a lot of podcasts out there talking about the history of women, or about histories of people of color, or some of messy, trickier histories. And as professional historians, we thought this is something that we can add to this conversation. So that's kind of where the idea came for the podcast. How we met, we were all graduate students at the University of Buffalo. We were all 3 of us have finished our PhDs, and 1 is still a PhD student. And so we are all still based in Buffalo, even though we've, moved on to other institutions, and are all 3 out of 4 of us are professional historians teaching in universities.
Okay. Last but not least, Matt.
Oh, frame it with something. Okay, all right. No. So I listened to my first podcast in 2012. It was History of Rome, and I am a little older than some of the people here, and I just loved history, and I was always a history nerd. And my dad gave me a copy of Moorhead's White Nile, which is kind of an old classic white men going through Africa kind of thing, in this case the Nile. And but it was fantastic, and when I was a kid I just loved that. And I was always a sucker for things like, pirate movies and any history type stuff. So it's just very, I want to say, old school white guy learning stuff. Mm-hmm. Is what my background is. But I always love that stuff. So I work in internet related things and so forth. Do a lot of writing, but So after a few years, I had an opportunity. My wife was doing real well in her job, and she said, well, do what you want. And I was just like, well, one of the things was a creative itch, I guess I'd say. It was just fun. It was cool. And I never really came into it with any much conception of what it was going to be ultimately, but I picked something that I loved, history, and then I just found something that really wasn't served. I didn't think people would do like episodes here and there about, it's about Henry Hudson or some explorer, but there was no like dedicated podcast to it. So I just kind of did something and just experimented with it on my own for a few months, and I just kind of said, I'll start doing it, and that's what I've been doing. And pretty much the podcast I started with, the first one, is pretty much the exact same format that I've been doing 3 years now. So.
And my story is, in 2012 I started a podcast called How Jamaica Conquered the World, and I thought this podcasting thing was easy because the first week that I did it, it was iTunes podcast of the month, and I thought, this is easy, right? I'm an utter genius. None of the other 7 podcasts I've done since have ever attained those heights. So, but I did that show because my parents are Jamaican, though I'm English, and I knew those stories inherently, and I couldn't read about the story of the Jamaican diaspora in any books. So I did that, and what I realised was that I utterly loved sound, not just the sound of my own voice, but music and sound effects, and I wanted to create a story which wasn't just me, a guy talking into a microphone. So from that then led on to 10 American presidents. I'm absolutely fascinated by the experiment that is America. I still think, is this country going to work? I don't know. It's still up in the balance. But I love the fact that there is an American exceptionalism, and it's the fact that it's the only country in the world which says you have to believe in the Constitution to be a really good citizen. That doesn't happen anywhere else. Nobody in the UK knows the UK Constitution. We don't have a written one, etc., etc. Nobody in Germany is called a good German because they know the Constitution. And that makes America exceptional. So I decided to do an audio documentary series about the 10 American presidencies, which I see as being pivotal. And I started off with somewhat of a bang. I got Dan Carlin and Mike Duncan. Mr. Duncan seems to be getting a lot of name checks in this. And there he is over in the back there. So he has sired a lot of podcasters, this man. So that is my origin story. So, but what we're going to do in this session is I'm just going to ask like 10 minutes worth of questions to get the panel all warmed up. But you haven't really come to hear me witcher on. So after those 10 minutes, I'm going to throw it out to you. It's basically to ask questions to the people who you've been listening to the podcast for years. So first question to you, Matt. Do you believe, one of the interesting things for me that what you said is that you're kind of aware that some people might see some of the people who you follow as being somewhat kind of neo-colonialist or whatever. Do you think, number one, that's fair? And then number two, are we forgetting the heroic deeds of men past?
On the first one, yeah, sure, it's fair. I think one of the things I would very much encourage anyone is, the world is full of shades of gray. And one of the things we tend to want to do is make things black and white, tomorrow is the 527th anniversary of, can anyone tell me? Columbus lands in someplace in the Bahamas. You bring up Christopher Columbus to people, and you will get virulent reactions. I mean, just like murder and kill, and yeah, he did. But he also, who had the balls to like hop in a ship and sail into nowhere? That doesn't make them not, that doesn't. You don't want to take away the good and the bad of anyone, because it's all just part of what they are. And so when, I know there is a tendency to, like I say, we want to find something to latch onto about people. And, I just saw this about Mahatma Gandhi the other day, where there's people, but they're human beings and they're all parts. And so I think that, it's always, and every story has two sides, three sides, four sides, as we talked about with the title of things. So, so that was the first question. What was the second one you asked me?
You answered it. Don't worry about it. Sarah, Matt says it's stories of human beings. One of the things I found really compelling about just your topic list is that you don't go through the stereotypical Western European, and that means North American as well, kind of canon of topics.
Yeah.
So how exactly have you come by your topics going to be as diverse as Charlemagne's coronation day or Rastafarianism?
We, as professional historians, we each have an academic sort of specialization, right? So I'm a Civil War historian, like that's my day job. And so we each try to choose topics that that fit with our expertise, right? But we also are trying to choose topics that we think need to be told, right? So I'll give an example that last year, I think it was almost exactly a year ago, we were recording, and we record all of our episodes in one day, and we took a break after recording the first two, and we were all on our phones following the Kavanaugh hearings. And I said, we need to do an episode about the history of rape. And that's not what I do as a scholar. It's not what I write about, right? It's not my research. But it was something that I felt like we need to provide context in this conversation. Like, this is something that we can do as historians, is put this out there. And so even though we have sort of niches that we focus on in our day jobs, we try to branch out of that when it comes to the podcast. And I find that that's enormously important for me as a scholar and as a citizen, as a human, to like spend time really digging very deeply into a particular topic that's outside of my field. I think that's important for me to get outside of my field a little bit. And that's why, none of us are historians necessarily of Jamaica, but we just did an episode about the history of, as you mentioned, of the Rastafari religion. And it was wonderful for us to learn as much as it is, I think, good to put that out for listeners to learn.
Mishi, can I just say I have hair envy? As a man who struggles with hair, I'm looking at that and I'm going, wow.
I just got my haircut, so...
You arrogant person you are.
Rubbing it in our faces.
The way that you go about your shows is to have kind of first-person narratives of stories which you then connect to the history of the state of Israel. How exactly do you plan those out? Is it a case of here is a topic and we need to find a voice for that? Tell us exactly how you go about your kind of production process.
So some of our stories are first-person narratives. Some of them are, reported pieces. I mean, the premise of the show was that the Israel that people hate and the Israel that people love are both imaginary places, and that we wanted to tell the story of the country in which we live, which has. Like every other country in the world, wonderful things and horrible things and beauty and ugliness, and we wanted to, much like any country in the really, Israel is a very compartmentalized society. So I'm from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is about 900,000 people. A third of them are Arabs, a third of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews, a third of them are neither of those things. And the truth of the matter is that growing up, I didn't have any friends that were Arabs or ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I'm not alone in that. I mean, this is the experience of most people, that we surround ourselves by people who are pretty similar to us. And what maybe is a little bit unique to Israel is that it's a very small place, so you're in constant interaction with people who aren't like you, and you see them all the time, and you sort of walk past them on the street and you know what they have or don't have on their head, or what color skin they have, or what they're wearing, and then you kind of put them in a box, and you think that you know much about them and what their dinner table looks like and who they vote for, and what I've discovered working on the show is how rarely that's true. And what we tried to do with the show was to play this little trick, which I guess you do when creating a podcast, which was that by eliminating the visual element, we would enable our audience a little bit more time in which they can suspend their judgment and not put someone in a box and say like, oh, I know everything there is to know about that person, and actually listen to their story. And it was tricky because it's hard to collect stories. And initially we told stories of our friends and people in our circles, our families, and so on and so forth, and started sort of venturing out. And today, the show gladly has now had 4 seasons in Hebrew and 4 seasons in English, and has grown. We're a large team, so now most of our stories come from pitches from listeners, and we in fact employ a whole person whose job it is to answer the pitches. But it's I mean, the trying to sort of reach at not the DNA but a DNA of a country is a difficult thing, because the country is a collection of millions of people, and each one has a story. And at the end of the day, the deep premise of the show is that a person is a person is a person, and everyone has a story to tell. So so it's a question of like going out, and I'll just end by saying one thing is, like, early on we didn't know how to reach populations that were very different than us. We didn't know how to enter into different communities. So we had this project where we chose an address. So the most common street name in Israel is Herzl Street. Herzl was the founder of the Zionist movement. And there are 54 Herzl Streets. And we chose number 48 because the state was established in 1948. And we went, and out of the 54 Herzl Streets, 39 of them had a number 48. And we went and we knocked on every single 48 Herzl Street in the entire country, from north to south. And we just talked to whoever happened to live or work there. And that kind of gives you a cross-section, because you meet rich people and poor people and Jews and Muslims and even Christians and capitalists and socialists and right-wingers and left-wingers. And that was a cool way of accessing. And more than anything, I've come through this project to learn more about my own country.
It's interesting. Somewhat chimes with me when I started my very first podcast, How Jamaica Conquered the World. So in 2012, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the independence of the island of Jamaica. It used to be a British colony. And in 2011, I set this company, then I sold it in 2011, and then I had nothing to do. And I looked at the calendar, I thought, next year, the land of my parents' birth is going to be 50 years old. Jamaican athletes, Hussein Bolt et al., are going to do quite well in the Olympics, and the Olympics was going to be in London, and I lived in London at the time, so I thought, I'm going to do this podcast. And I kind of had this thing kind of like mapped out in my head, because I hardly ever write anything down. And it was Christmas time, and I was sat speaking to my daughter went to the local neighbourhood school, and there was this lovely guy, white guy. He'd come round for Christmas to have a mince pie, and we were there chatting away, and he started telling me this wonderful story about the fact that he really liked reggae and ska. And he says, my dad, we lived on this council estate, social housing for the Americans here, which is just about everybody. And he says, the local racist party was called the National Front. They turned up one day because a black family had moved in just down the road. And the guy said, can I speak to your father? And my dad came to the door, and he says, there's a black family moved in down the road. They're going to be playing that reggae and that ska stuff. And we don't want that. This is the 1970s in England. And he said, my dad just closed the door and sat and said, son, sit down here. Black people created jazz. I quite like jazz. They're very good at cricket. I love cricket. We've got no problem with these people. And that was the start of my first recorded episode. And I was doing a story about the international influence of the island of Jamaica. It started with a white English guy telling me this story of how he appreciated the music that we associate with the island. So that very much chimes with what you're saying. Mr. Pearson, just like you talked about that penguin historical atlas, Muir's Historical Atlas was the thing which made me realise as a child that countries change shape politically. And the Roman Empire was always pink in Muir's Historical Atlas, and in 476, one half of it disappeared, and I thought they'd made a mistake. What's all this stuff doing in the East? And at that point, I must have been about 11 or 12, and like most 12 and 11-year-olds who were history nerds, I thought I knew everything about history. So this was a big blind spot of mine. And I very much come from this Western European tradition of history. So if we're English, if we're British as we are, we understand England, France, Germany, kind of Italy, Spain. How much of a blind spot do you think there still is with our understanding of the Byzantine Empire and also just of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, full stop? It's a big
easy question. I mean, I think there's a massive blind spot. I think certainly whenever I've put forward a statement that wasn't cautious enough about the reception of Byzantium today in countries in the Balkans and Turkey and Greece, I've got some very interesting comments from people who are obviously listening to the podcast. They're historically minded, and they say, in everywhere from the north of Russia down to the border of Bulgaria, that the reception of the Eastern Roman Empire's influence has gone in 100 different directions. So I would say there's a big blind spot, and I would say you can trace a lot of the conflicts in that part of the world back to Byzantium, right down to the Cold War. Why is Eastern Europe and Russia seen as sort of different to the West? Going back to the religious division between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, but then you look at all the wars in the Balkans, where you've got these populations who kind of established themselves in the face of not wanting to become part of the Roman Empire, and finding a pocket of territory that was defensible because they did not want imperial tax collectors coming in. And once the Ottomans took over that area, that community was then sort of safe from being taken over by their neighbours for a period, and then the Ottomans go and suddenly they all are turning on each other. So I mean, it's across half a continent of stuff that I would say a lot of Western education just skips or skirts over.
The one thing I have to say to you, Robin, is that I think your podcast for me is the one where, because I start from such a, dare I say, a low base of innate knowledge, that I actually by far learn the most from. And the one thing that blew me away was, I think, one of your first episodes, if not the first, I can't remember, was when you talked about the Italian invasion of the Rhodes Islands in 1912, and the Rhodes Islanders come out to meet the Italians because they wanted to see what Italians looked like, because they saw themselves as Romans, and that absolutely blew my mind in terms of identity and the power of labels and kind of history, etc. So let's throw out some questions.
My question is for Rishi, and I thought it was really interesting what you said about regard to Israel, how sort of there's this perception that everything is perfect or it's terrible, and that neither is really the case. Who are most of your listeners Jewish, non-Jewish, and you probably get some pushback? Is it equally from all sides, or are you generally well received?
So when we started this in Hebrew, and we were the first podcast in Israel, and it was very easy to be the number one podcast. And then we did a whole season of this, and then we realized that if we wanted, this was sort of a late night hobby for me and my friends, and we realized that if this was going to continue, we needed to have a budget, and we needed to make this into somewhat of a job. And I wrote something like 1,000 letters of inquiry to various different foundations, and no one replied, basically. And maybe the 2 or 3 that did said, listen, this sounds interesting, but really we're not going to fund anything that we can't understand. And they were all based here in America. They were American Jewish foundations, basically, and that was the first time that we thought about creating an English version of the show, and that was somewhat of a counterintuitive thought because we were essentially now going to create the American version of the Israeli version of This American Life. And we were total amateurs. We didn't know what we were doing. I mean, suddenly we were going to compete with This American Life. I mean, this was absurd. So we didn't know who was going to listen and if people at all were going to listen. And thankfully, things turned out and the way they did, and now there are, a lot of listeners all over the world. Speaking about our English shows, about 2/3 of them are in America, and a third around the world. And the majority, though, not the vast majority of them are Jews, which is, to me, always a little bit disappointing because it doesn't seem like much of a challenge to get, Susan from St. Louis, who's 55 years old and volunteers at her local synagogue and is on like the Hadassah board or whatever, to listen to a podcast about Israel. It's much more interesting to me to get people who are not at all engaged in a conversation about Israel to be, and we have those people. I mean, we would like more and more, of course, but there's something interesting about the pushback aspect of this project, which is that almost everything that goes on, almost if you go online, almost everything about Israel is contentious. So you'll see talkbacks of people, yelling at each other and this and this and that, and somehow we've managed to avoid that. And we do this very, very intentionally and carefully, which is that we're not a political podcast. We don't engage in what's traditionally called everything's politics, right? Everything's political. If you do a story about Eritrean refugees who live in South Tel Aviv, that's a political topic. I mean, it's one that's debated in politics. But when people say political in the context of Israel, they mean the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's not that we don't have stories about Palestinians or settlers we do. But there's something that we've realized, which I think is true not only in the Israeli context, which is that it's very difficult to argue with the human interest story. Because if we do our job well, we're introducing you to a person who you might agree with, you might disagree with, but he or she is a person, just like you are as a listener. And you listen to their story and they're going through the same kind, let's say it's a Palestinian who the story is about, I don't know, taking his daughter to the first day of first grade and letting her, she's holding his hand and she goes into the classroom for the first time or something. It's kind of a touching moment that you can identify with no matter who you are. And by doing that, we've sort of avoided the general vitriol that exists about Israel. Luckily, as our audience grows, there's more people who have something to say about something, because people always have something to say. But by and large, I think that human interest is a real antidote to hatred.
Matt, even when you speak into a microphone and you are addressing obviously an audience and you get some feedback back from that audience. So tell us a little bit about, number one, your process and where you get your source material from for your podcast, but also tell us about the dialogue that then you've created with your listeners and how you kind of address that.
Source material, it obviously the older you get with whatever you're dealing with can be very difficult. Sometimes it literally does not exist, and for various reasons. So you do have to often dig. I queued her up there. So you do have to dig for stuff, and you have to find things. One of the things, I think, I'm not an academician, so I literally don't feel like I have that ability to be an academic and dig for sources and find those things. sometimes I don't have access to them. Sometimes it's, it's like, oh great, here's a translation in English. It's $186, and that's, and I just can't do that. Sometimes you have to drop things. You just have to rely, and I think one of the things I've really come to appreciate is people who are historians, because I have to find good people and rely on them oftentimes to give me the good outline of where my story is going. So getting source material is basically just looking. You want to find primary sources as often as possible, but I don't read Latin, I don't read Greek, I don't read any of that kind of stuff, so it does have to be translated for me. And oftentimes when it's written 500 years ago, it's practically ineligible. You just can't figure it out. So so finding the sources, it's just looking and finding good, even-handed sources. Modern materials really actually the more and more, because you read some old stuff and it's just 18th century stuff, and it's like, wait, there's a romance in the story about Balboa finding the Pacific Ocean. They literally will shoehorn stuff in just for popular work. So you do this and you try to do things as best as possible, and you literally at some point you just have to you let the pig go, and the grease pig go, and it's gone. So you have to, present you're not going to catch it. Nothing you can do about it. And so you have to, once you record stuff, you put it on, you're going to make mistakes. And that's when people love to come out of the woodwork, and I was telling someone about I misinterpreted the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean wrong, and it's just like, you feel like, oh my God, did I kill someone? And for the most of those people, that person you just have to ignore. But to be honest, the people who are listening to this kind of stuff are going to be nerdy history people like me, and they're just appreciative that the material's out there and it's done in a fashion that that they can enjoy. And so I don't get tons and tons of feedback, and it's generally positive, but I try to respond to every single person that comes through, and I try to thank people, and they all have ideas of where to go next. So
question for you, Sarah. I did an episode about Rastafari on my How to Make a Conquer the World series, and the one thing which I really took away from that was I'd speak to these Rastas and I'd say, so when did you become a Rasta? And they'll always say, I was always Rasta, which is obviously not the case. You weren't born with dreadlocks and whatever, but it's a concept that you never actually convert to being a Rasta. You just are one. So it's often about the third person you're saying, so when did you become a Rasta? And he says, I was always Rasta. I thought, okay. So my question to you is, which one of your topics was the most surprising for you? Or can you take away one nugget and say, I did not know that at all? Because you've done a lot of very different kind of topics.
It's a really good question. I think that there's probably several that I would say.
You've only got time for one.
I know. Every episode that I do, honestly, I come away from the research that I've done learning something new or interpreting something differently, like something that I thought that I understood, because I'm a history professor, right? So like I've been at this for a while, so sometimes you lull yourself into the kind of belief that you already kind of know it, right? And then you read something, you immerse yourself in one topic for a little while to put together an episode, and you realize, oh, I can't believe that I got through this without realizing this. And now the one example I'll give is the episode that's actually dropping on Sunday, which is about the ghost dance religion. And at the end of the episode, we get obviously to what is inevitable when you talk about the ghost dance, which is the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I thought that I was doing an episode about the story of the ghost dance that I had always heard, which was that it was a very backward-looking religion of Indians wanting to return to a world that no longer existed, right? And that the white people were going to go away and the buffalo were going to come back and everything was going to return to a previous state. And as I read more and more, I realized, like, that is not at all what the ghost dance religion was about. It was about moving into the future that was being shaped by Americans, being shaped by white people, and trying to find ways to bring Indian culture into that future that was being given to Indians. And that's a very different way of looking at the ghost dance. It's a very progressive, forward-moving religion rather than this sort of backward-looking religion. And I found that incredibly profound. And I actually, if you listen to the episode, you'll listen to me at the end just like yelling at myself about, how I've been teaching this to my students incorrectly. And I think that was, inevitable based on what I'd read, right? But at the same time, super glad that I spent the time to read this material and sort of recognize that I should be teaching it a little bit differently, because it changes the way that we think about Wounded Knee too, I think. So I found that really powerful.
So I'm just getting started in considering trying to turn what was my master's into some kind of podcast, and I guess this is really for kind of the last three of you, although feel free. Mm-hmm. Which is just that, I'm a medievalist, and I'm going to be talking about the kind of interaction between medieval Europe and Africa. And that's the kind of story that gets me interested in history. Is always when I'm reading something like, I had no idea about this, and I love that I didn't. This completely changes how I think of the world, about how colonialism is always taught as like the end point of a progression of Western history, as opposed to looking at it and seeing as the continuity of African history being interrupted. But at the same time, I'm also very aware that I'm a white person steeped in the Western canon, talking about a history that is not mine, and worried about that. Especially since it's not a kind of topic where I can be interviewing people who were involved, because they're very dead. So I'm just wondering how kind of you've worked through that, about the kind of the representations, and how you can do something that you feel is important, getting these new perspectives out there, even if they're not technically your stories to tell.
Well, I'm going to start, and I must admit, I'm very excited to listen to your podcast about this, because, and this is one of my rants, that as a person of colour, who I am the direct descendant of the slave trade. My ancestors were taken from Africa and dropped in the Caribbean, right? But 10% of my DNA is actually white and Scottish, right? And so people of colour have to be, in the Western world, have to be careful that we don't say our history only starts from the slave trade, full stop. So when you're saying the medieval links that Europe had with Africa, I'm excited because you're going to talk about Prester John, the legend of this Ethiopian king and whatever. You can talk about the empires of Mali and Shanghai, and the fact that the Sultan went to Cairo and basically bankrupted it because he was that rich and he was black, right? So let's talk about that stuff, right? And the whole thing about this session, but also about history, is perspectives, okay? And yours is as valid as mine. And what you have to do is just be generous to other perspectives. It's not to say that yours is right and yours is wrong, okay? And dare I say it, I think Matt is somewhat, I'm going to answer slightly for you, then it's over to you, sir. Matt's first answer to the question was to acknowledge that the canon of explorers is now a fraught one in the modern perspective. That's not to say that they didn't actually do this stuff. They did, and whatever, right? So as long as you take in some kind of an understanding of the modern understanding of what people did before in the past and whatever, your perspective is as valid as anybody's. So be a white American and to talk about it, but to try and be generous and to say that there are other ways to looking at this story. Over to you, sir.
And you're basically right, but I think the biggest thing is just be honest of where you're coming from, and just simply say it, and people will acknowledge it, and you'll be like, I am a 55-year-old white man talking about. I wasn't accusing you of being a 55-year-old, but who you are and what you're interested in, and people will go, okay, that's cool. And if they aren't, there's generally no way you're going to get them on your side to begin with. And I run that whole thing with I cannot understand the concept of what happened to gazillions of indigenous peoples because of what explorers did. I can acknowledge it and talk about it and at least acknowledge that there are huge impacts, but I don't know those stories, and frankly a lot of us don't, because those people just disappeared, because of whatever. But you just have to be honest. Just let them know where you're coming from.
Can I throw
Sarah?
something in?
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that I would say is that we try to be sort of radically transparent about the scholarship that we're relying on. So we want to make it very clear that we are not the ones that wrote, say, the book that we are, using the material from. And so that is a way of saying, it sounds very trendy, but I think of it almost as signal boosting the work of other scholars, right? So I have, say, if you're taking somebody's book on these connections, saying I'm really relying heavily on this person's book, they're the expert on this particular niche, here's the link to Amazon, here's the link to your local library. You can't put that link, but you know what I mean, sending people out so that you're actually lifting up somebody else's work rather than appropriating that work.
Just to add one last thing. I think also the thing about podcasts is, yes, you go to get the topic you're interested in, but you then stay because the host's way of communicating clicks with you.
Yeah. So
the value is in you bringing your perspective of trying to get rid of the baggage of your education and learning something new. And that's part of your unique self.
2 more questions.
I've only listened to your podcast, so my favorite episode from that is the one you did the clip on, which was sort of a didactic historical fiction, and I really like the style of that, and I really like how I felt like I understood the context of everything before and after that you were trying to explain much better, and I'm curious. I don't actually know if anyone else has done anything like that, but what are the challenges involved in that sort of didactic historical fiction of setting up an episode like that?
So just to add a bit of context, so what you heard from most of the panel was quite typical of their podcast. What I chose was completely not typical. My podcast is obviously me doing what I'm doing now, explaining Byzantine history in normal speech off a script. What I played to you was a clip of a little bit of fiction I wrote based on the sources, but nice to get that feedback from a listener. I felt people weren't listening to what I was explaining, or they weren't picturing what I was explaining. When we think of the Roman army, we have a certain image of organization and power and depth and so on. And my point here was trying to explain, by this point in history, it's all guerrilla warfare. The Romans have become the people that they spent a millennia beating down. They have now had to adapt to those tactics. And I was getting questions from listeners saying, yeah, but what about formations? What about weaponry? And I was like, they're not hearing what I'm saying in normal speech, so I almost need to find a different way to get through to them. So I wrote this piece of fiction, and that, Royfield slightly edited the clip to be clear it was me, but actually the episode just began in fiction. No explanation, no nothing. Because I thought, again, they'll be going, what the hell is this? And it'll stick in their head more. So that was the context of that. But has anyone else sort of approached an episode in a completely different way to try?
We've done a tiny bit of it. The Ghost Dance episode that I just mentioned, I start a little bit by trying to put somebody in the position of this ethnologist who went out to Nevada to meet the Paiute prophet Wovoka and interview him. I tried to put listeners kind of in that position, but it was for a tiny snippet at the beginning. But we did one episode that was about the history of gas lighting and heating in Victorian London, and my executive producer Averill actually wrote this whole story where you're coming home after a long day of work and it's very cold outside and you turn on the gas, and then she'd go into the history, and it ended up being really cute. I think it worked really well, but it was just one episode. We don't do that typically.
It's just my sort of goal myself is to sort of expand, to make sure that that other perspectives, part of history podcast, sort of conversation broadly.
I'll answer it by just saying, do it. Yeah. That's the biggest thing that happens with people is they don't do it, and they say I want to do this, I'm going to do this, and don't quit, and because it's very easy when life gets in the way, right? Because that's the coolest thing, and the last is there's history. Mishi says we just experienced history like 2 seconds ago, and the thing is, this is me doing my little. My father passed away a few years ago from Alzheimer's, and I lost history there. And when I went to talk to him at times about questions about his life, he suddenly was forgetting them. Yeah. And so, one of the things like you do is you were able to talk to people, and you guys talk to people. Some of these we can't because it's 1,000, but do it. And don't miss the opportunity, because it's all history that gets lost if you do not talk to people and do not, especially if you can record them, it's gold, So don't miss those opportunities and just do this kind of stuff, because the worst case scenario is you fail or you don't like it or whatever and you move on.
Like, I really think it's interesting that you all have podcasts more or less focused in Eastern areas. Like, you already talked about this a little bit, but do you feel you have a responsibility to incorporate, like, some aspects of, say, Western culture, like Western European in Raman's case, or the U.S. and Mishi's, and, like, how would you incorporate it into your podcast further, like, going along? Does that kind of make sense? Like, I mean, like, how do you relate to Western culture in your podcasting when you do in the East?
It's difficult for me to approach it without Western culture being my filter in that sense. Obviously, I try to tour the Empire's neighbours as I go, and get the perspective of medieval Westerners seeing the East.
I've never thought about that, but maybe the best answer that I can give is that sort of my approach to what constitutes a story or a good story is somewhat of a Western approach. I mean, I've had times where I've sat in tents with old Bedouin sheikhs who have told me yarns that have continued for 7 hours, and that in my mind is not a story in the way that I think of a story. So maybe that's kind of my own bias.
I think everybody, before you go, you need to put your hands together for our esteemed panel.